Friends, allies, and Americans, welcome to the Defense of Democracy podcast, where we tell the stories of folks who defend your children's rights by advocating for inclusive public school systems and who fight for diversity across our nation. I'm your host, Karen Swoboda. Let's get into it. Welcome, listeners, today on the Defense of Democracy podcast. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Newsome, who wrote a book called The Pink Triangle Holocaust. Dr. Newsome, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks, Karen, first of all, for the invitation. It's great to be here on the podcast with you. So a little about myself. I am a public historian that focuses on LGBTQ history, both in Germany and the United States. I grew up in South Georgia. And then went on to Buffalo, New York for graduate school. Had not seen snow at all in my life before moving to
Wow.
Buffalo. Got plenty of it once moved there, though, and have since earned my PhD in history. As you said, wrote a book, Pink Triangle Legacies, coming out in the shadow of the Holocaust, which really tells the story of the Nazis' LGBTQ victims, but also how they were remembered or kind of intentionally forgotten in the post-Holocaust period. And so now, really dedicate myself to honoring and preserving the Nazis' LGBTQ victims, their memory, and carrying on their legacy by confronting homophobia and transphobia in our world today.
I mean, it's such an important topic and such a really interesting topic, and particularly in the sense that I had never heard about and it is called the Pink Triangle Holocaust, right? Is that the official?
Pink Triangle Legacies, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you tell me a little bit about that for myself, but also for my listeners who aren't aware about what happened to gay Germans during the Holocaust?
Sure. So, I guess to kind of even explain the title of the book, a lot of times folks today, if you ask anyone, what is the main symbol of the LGBTQ rights movement and the LGBTQ community, we would say the rainbow, right? And kind of all of its different variations. But for a long time, especially from the 70s well into the 90s, the most, I would say, widespread, kind of popularly used symbol of the gay and lesbian movement was the Pink Triangle. And I remember as a graduate student, not really understanding what that symbol meant. I saw it everywhere. I didn't come out until a little bit later in life. When I went to Buffalo, started going to LGBTQ, bars and getting into the scene, and started seeing these pink triangles everywhere. And I'm wondering, like, what is that? Where did that come from?
Yeah.
And so then really started doing, using my historian skills to explore this symbol that was becoming more, important in my personal life, and came to find out that the Pink Triangle was actually, it originated in the Nazi concentration camp system. And so in this system, the Nazis devised a series of color-coded triangle badges that they forced all of their prisoners to wear, that it marked or indicated their so-called crime or their reason for being in the concentration camps. And so Jews wore yellow triangles, red was for political prisoners, green for so-called common criminals, and there was a whole list of different colored triangles, and men who were sent to the camps because they were gay were marked with a pink triangle. And so this really opened up, a chapter of history that was really unknown to me. And even as an undergraduate, I had studied, that was my major. I studied the Holocaust Nazi
Mhm.
Germany, World War II, every class that I could take on it at my university. And
Mhm.
it wasn't really until the very end of my time as a student that a guest lecturer came and gave a talk about what happened to LGBTQ folks in Nazi Germany, and
Mhm.
it made me flustered that number one, I had studied it for 4 years, and none of the books or my professors had taught me about it, but it also made me upset at myself because this was also the time of my life when I was in the process of coming out,
Mhm.
and also really interested in history, and I had never stopped to think about what happened to people like me during the Holocaust. um, and so really this topic was always kind of an academic interest and an academic project, but was also a personal project of exploration, of finding out where do people like me fit into history, and really what is our own history. Um, and what I found in the archives was really um, moving, and not always in a good way,
Mhm. Mhm.
because clearly the Nazis, for the Nazi leaders, anti-Semitism was really the foundation of their movement of right of considering Jews to be subhuman and kind of the cause of all of Germany's woes. But they, in their quest to forge a so-called master race, they also had several other groups of people that they considered to be outsiders or un-German, and one of those groups was the LGBTQ community. And in the late 1920s and early 1930s, even as the Nazis were gaining more followers,
Mhm.
Germany, or at least Berlin, as the capital city, had become a kind of undisputed LGBTQ capital of the world.
Mhm.
It was
Okay.
a folks from New York and London and Paris all came to Berlin to experience a level of, I'm not going to say full acceptance, but at least an unprecedented level of tolerance that just didn't exist anywhere else in the world. And so the Nazis really positioned themselves as being specifically well, they didn't use the word anti-LGBTQ. Everything was kind of put under the umbrella term of homosexual. So they were, they positioned themselves as the anti-homosexual party that would clean up Germany, would kind of restore Germany's values after its decline into this so-called decadence. And so really the LGBTQ community was one of the very first that the Nazis targeted in their propaganda and also in their policies.
And this, and a lot of, I mean, I'm sure that a lot of our listeners are seeing that there's a lot of correlation
Mm-hmm.
into what's happening today,
Mm-hmm.
and I want everybody to take a minute to think about what Dr. Newsome is saying right now.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think um, that's one of the biggest surprises to me was the fact that we kind of think in history that things just automatically get better as time goes forward, and so to think that kind of there was this an LGBTQ golden age before the Nazis just really didn't fit into my understanding of that history of so-called progress. But to understand that there were, in Berlin alone, in the single city, there were over 100 different cafes, bars, clubs, organizations that either catered exclusively to LGBTQ folks or made it known that it was a safe space for them. And there were
Mhm.
LGBTQ magazines and newspapers and all kind of publications,
Wow.
sports clubs. I mean, everything that you think of as kind of a modern uh, gay community or gay movement, it existed in Germany, in Berlin at least, from about 1920 all the way to about 1933 when the Nazis came to power. And so to see that there was this vibrancy, this complex community that gained again visibility that had never been
Mhm.
seen before, and then was suddenly destroyed and driven back underground by this movement really within a matter of weeks, was just astonishing, and really drove home a lesson to me that progress, no matter how you define it, progress is always fragile, right, and needs constant protection. But just because some groups earn particular rights or protections doesn't mean that those can't be taken away.
100%. Tell me about, and this is something I know through my discussions with some of my transgender volunteers and friends. Um, wasn't there a hospital, like a surgical center, where you could have, and what,
Yeah.
and wasn't that targeted? But I don't know the whole story, so I'm just wanted to ask you about it.
Yeah, so absolutely. There was an organization called the Institute for Sexual Science,
Hmm.
and this was co-founded by a man named Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who himself was um, socialist. He was Jewish, was also kind of semi-openly gay. I mean, of course, no one was really kind of publicly out back then, but it was very well known that, I mean, he and his partner were kind of a known couple in Berlin at the time. And so
Hmm.
Hirschfeld was a world famous sexologist, what was called a sexologist, so a scientific researcher of human sexuality and gender. And
Hmm.
his research really, he was one of the first to um, argue that being LGBTQ was natural and inborn, and therefore shouldn't be discriminated against.
Hmm.
Folks shouldn't be discriminated against for something that they couldn't control. Um, and he was also, I would say, the first to argue that being transgender was different than being gay. That there was really, like, in our parlance, there is a difference between gender identity and sexual orientation.
Right. Yeah.
Before that, folks just kind of, mix the two together. And so, as part of that research, he found the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin in 1919,
Mhm.
and he really is a pioneer in studying, but then advocating for the transgender community. And again, he coins the term, which now is a little outdated or means something different, but he coined the term transvestite, which
Uh-huh.
was his
Uh-huh.
way of really trying to give a legitimacy that there is this group of people, that they're a community, and need to be respected and treated as such. But uh, he one of the things that he does is partners with the Berlin Police Department, because at the time, um, essentially being transgender could be criminalized, and there
Okay.
wasn't necessarily a law that targeted being transgender, but the police would arrest transgender folks under a law against causing a public nuisance, because they argued
Okay.
that
Okay.
so-called cross-dressing in public just disturbed the peace, and so that was often the law.
Again, we hear that,
Yes,
right? Oh my
yeah.
gosh.
We're
Okay.
even today, it's that, oh, we're not targeting people for being transgender. It's just that they're
We just don't like how you dress
how you dress. Exactly.
and how you speak and right.
So Hirschfeld went to the Berlin Police Department and actually educated the police chief and their leadership in saying, look, this is transgender, or as he would have said, transvestite people
Mhm.
have these specific challenges that they have in
Mhm.
order just to navigate everyday life.
Mhm.
And so what he established was what came to be known and kind of on the street called transvestite certificates, where
Really?
he, as his institute, would write essentially a doctor's note saying this person was born female but lives openly as male. They that needs to be respected, and in
Okay.
order, I love the kind of the terminology that he says, in order for a healthy alignment of their soul, needs to
Wow.
be
Yeah.
allowed to live openly and go out in public dressed in men's clothing, as how he would have said it. So this
Mhm.
person could take this doctor's note from Hirschfeld to the Berlin Police Department, and they would issue one of these certificates that had a photograph and the official stamp from the Berlin Police Department, and essentially it acted as a gender affirming ID that they could carry with them, that would essentially protect them from being arrested under these laws for
Mhm.
so-called cross-dressing. And all this is in 1919, early 1920s, which just completely, it just blows my mind the amount of progress that was made in the same land, the same country that produced the Nazi movement as well.
It, and there's a lot to be said about the German culture, and from what I've observed, the way that they handle, the result of Nazism, the way they educate their children, the way that they, acknowledge that moment in history. And I think that we're always about halfway through the program. I like to give a volunteer shout out. And I think this is a perfect time to give a shout out to one of our transgender volunteers. And we have a few, but this is Diana Patton is our Navy, is a Navy veteran. She is the commander of Veterans Defending Democracy. And she's actually the one who is introduced me to you and your book. And to anyone who's listening, Diana and Dr. Newsome are participating in the Defense of Democracy readout event. And Dr. Newsome will be discussing his book during this readout. So if you are interested in being on a call with Dr. Jake Newsome talking about his book, discussing the Pink Triangle Legacies, what you need to do is go to defenseofdemocracy.org/readout and then look for that event and register. I think it's going to be just an amazing discussion where you're getting a group of people to read this book and get together and learn so much about what there is to learn. You had mentioned, so a couple things I want to say that just the etymology of words is just so fascinating to me to say, okay, transvestite, like there was no word for it at one time. And it was so necessary to have that word to be able to explain what that was. Tell me, but you had said, and that what happened very quickly. You said in a matter of weeks. So how can you go into a little bit about how that unfolded?
Sure.
Berlin's a big, like, bustling, metropolitan city.
It absolutely is. And Berlin, for the Nazis, held a special place because, of course, it is the capital of this new Germany that they want to build. But it is also, they are very well aware that it is kind of this unofficial queer capital of the world. They know that Berlin has this reputation across the world as being a gay mecca of sorts. And so they really, at the beginning, focus their attention very harshly on destroying the really vibrant LGBTQ culture in Berlin. And so the Nazis come to power at the last day of January 1933, and already by the end of February and into early March, they begin passing a series of policies in which it essentially shuts down what they call places of immorality or vice. And so, of course, it's broad enough that they can define that however they want to. But one of the very first ways, of course, targets of these policies are these networks of LGBTQ nightclubs, of headquarters for the newspapers, the political organizations. And so really they, with using the Nazi stormtroopers, but also the regular Berlin police officers, go throughout the city and shut down they do raids on the organizations, they shut them down. And so, like I said, in Berlin, it is driven back underground within a matter of weeks. We know that throughout the rest of the country, it kind of comes in waves. So it's 1934 before they go after and really concentrate on the gay scene in Munich and Frankfurt and in Hamburg. It doesn't really get kind of intensified until 1936. But we also know that the Nazis, one reason they left some gay organizations, kind of left them alone, so to speak, for a longer period, is because they realized that they wanted to spy on those gay bars or gay clubs, so that way they could arrest more people. That they could use that essentially as put them under surveillance. One of the things I'll point out is that the Nazis, out of everyone in the LGBTQ community, the Nazis felt that queer men posed the most dangerous threat to the government. And that's because in Germany, just like all the other countries around the world, it was men who had access to positions of power, right? It was, men ran national politics, the military, the economy. And so in the Nazis' mind, any type of so-called deviance in a man, if they were gay or bi or, whatever, that would be more of a direct threat to the everyday running of the system than if a woman was a lesbian, for example.
Right.
And so
women didn't matter as much.
they essentially misogyny
right.
drove.
Well, probably saved some of the, right. So,
And there's a lot of research now happening from incredible scholars that show, yes, it might not have been official Nazi policy to target all, lesbians, for example, or all transgender people that kind of ordinary. Well, when I say ordinary, I mean Nazis kind of lowered down the chain of command, took it upon themselves to essentially go after lesbians or transgender folks because maybe they were personally extra homophobic or transphobic. I don't, and so for a long time, I think historians kind of said, well, there was this law, paragraph 175, that specifically criminalized gay men. And since there wasn't a kind of a copycat law for women or trans folks, they didn't really get persecuted. And that's just not the case. The Nazis did absolutely arrest and send to camps lesbians and trans folks when they came like on the Nazis' radar.
Right. So there was, they went into Berlin and pulled these German citizens out into concentration camps? Like how?
Yeah.
And no one.
It absolutely. I mean, they put them into camps. A lot of times, if they arrested one man, they would essentially torture them until they gave up the names of other LGBTQ folks.
Right.
Sometimes they would wait until they had a long list. Then they would just go to a kind of a massive coordinated raid. But over the course of the 12 years that the Nazis were in power, they arrested over 100,000 men under their anti-gay law. And they sent about half of those to prison. And then anywhere between 10 and 15,000 so-called repeat offenders. So these were men who had been arrested more than once. The Nazis essentially said, well, they need a harsher punishment, and they were sent to concentration camps where the vast majority of them died.
Wow.
Officially, on paper, the Nazis' policies for queer men was to re-educate or cure them and then reintegrate them back into society, because they said, well, you know what, they're still Germans. They still have quote unquote good German blood. We want them to contribute to society, but they've just kind of lost their way. They just need to be kind of reoriented back to being straight, and then they'll be a good German again.
There's a very famous picture of Nazis burning books. Can you tell me a little bit about what we're really seeing when we look at that picture?
Yeah. So you're right. A lot of folks probably have seen this at some point in a documentary or in a museum. The really famous images of Nazis and ordinary folks, or who aren't in uniform, standing around a huge bonfire of books burning. And one of the things that I was really surprised to learn is that the largest bonfire there in Berlin actually was compiled of books, articles, and rare artifacts from the Institute for Sexual Science that we talked about earlier. Because, again, the Nazis viewed, as they would have said, deviant sexuality as a threat to essentially to the birth rate of the master race. And so they targeted the Institute because the Institute was, advocating for the decriminalization of homosexuality. They were trying to advocate for social acceptance of LGBTQ people. And as I said, Hirschfeld himself was Jewish and socialist. And so he was absolutely targeted by the Nazis. And so in May of 1933, luckily Hirschfeld himself was gone on a world speaking tour. but a group of college students who were supportive of the Nazi movement ransacked the institute and looted its very extensive library. And this library was the end result of Hirschfeld's life work of rare and truly unique books and artifacts that couldn't be found anywhere else in the world. And so in those images of those famous book burnings in Berlin, as I said, the largest one was made up of over 20,000 books, journals, and rare artifacts from the Institute for Sexual Science. Hirschfeld was never allowed to come back to Germany, and he died in exile.
Wow. And there's I want to bring this up because this just broke over the past summer, actually, August 15th. The New College of Florida has tossed out hundreds of library books and emptied its gender diversity library.
It's taken kind of straight from a playbook of understanding that information and knowledge is powerful. And so as the Nazis were seeking to establish their version of Germany, they knew that they also had to control the public narrative through propaganda, but they also needed to control access to information. And so, as I said, immediately upon taking power, they outlaw all LGBTQ publications. And so suddenly, LGBTQ folks don't have an outlet to be able to speak for themselves. And then they go even further to not just ban books, but then to literally destroy and burn them. And so it's kind of both sides of the same coin, where they are taking the voice away from LGBTQ folks and then using their own voice as the new government to spread just incredibly vicious propaganda about as they said, the homosexual lifestyle that positioned LGBTQ folks as dangers to Germany's children, that they were going to try to recruit Germany's children, especially German boys, into their lifestyle.
They call it grooming now, right?
Now it's very much. I mean, that's the same argument as grooming, and so when you look at history, you see that there are these waves we see that it's cyclical in a lot of ways. That these arguments and manifestations of homophobia and transphobia that we are witnessing today aren't new. That we've actually seen it before in the past, and we've seen the devastating consequences that it can lead to if we leave it unchecked.
Right. And there is, and about not leaving it unchecked, I mean, that's what my organization is dedicated to. And I always like to kind of end podcasts on a positive note. So I want to talk, I wanted to offer you an opportunity to talk about your nonprofit, which we recently welcomed into our coalition.
Yeah. So, after writing the book, Pink Triangle Legacies, we went on book tour. We spoke with folks from all across the country who were inspired, some kind of frightened by the lessons of the history and wanted to know what they could do to what they could do to help. And so earlier this year, we founded a new nonprofit called the Pink Triangle Legacies Project. And we are an organization that is dedicated to honoring the Nazis' queer and trans victims and carrying on their legacy by fighting homophobia and transphobia today through education, empowerment, and advocacy. And so we really do want to, we do a number of programs, from creating educational materials for, the classroom or community spaces, social media, but also have, beginning this fall, lined up a series of workshops and trainings that really give people not just the motivation, but the information, the networks, and the tools necessary to be able to identify and then combat homophobia and transphobia in their communities today.
And what a great an important and critical mission. So, from one founder to another, I commend you for taking this action. And certainly if there's any way that we can help you, I'm all in.
Thank you.
And again, just to reiterate, if anyone is listening and would like to join Defense of Democracy during our readout event and participate in Dr. Newsome's book discussion, go to defenseofdemocracy.org/podcast. And I will also put a link in our podcast notes with, an invitation to that readout event.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Newsome, for all your help and for your courage and your wisdom.
Thanks, and thank you. And I hope to see all of y'all there at the readout event.